Hey there, Marketeer. Welcome to the second video of this playlist about the Google Inspector, or in other words, the Google Chrome DevTools. Before we actually go and play around with changing the page right in front of our nose, I need to explain you something about what we're playing with. Because the information in the Elements tab is not per se always the same as the source code that we got directly sent from the server. Let me show you what I mean by that, by having a look at my own website. If we right-click on any page that is in front of us, you can either view the source or go to the inspector. When we click on this, we see a nicely formatted piece of HTML. This is actually the result of what was rendered by the browser. When we click on the view page source and we have a look at what we get from the server that was sent to the browser, it looks completely different. This is a lot of gibberish, which probably not a lot of people know what is exactly said here. What is important to realize is that this does not per se reflect what we see here immediately. And the reason for that is because what we see here is all of the CSS included and also all of the JavaScript executed. JavaScript and CSS to a certain degree can make changes to the page that actually the developer wanted to generate. And let me explain you what this difference actually is. Because it's important to understand when you talk to your colleagues that when they show you or they might ask you this question, that is the text for a scraper, for Google Scraper, in the page that Google should see it, right? Well, not always the case because it's not per se in the initial HTML file. Or maybe you will understand that Google is actually capable of rendering a DOM so that therefore it's not a problem to render your website with JavaScript, which is actually the case, but that's a whole different discussion. What do I mean with all of this? Well, let's type in a website. Let's go to bol.com, which is the Dutch Amazon, more or less. Your browser sends a request to a server, in this case, probably in the Netherlands, because it's a Dutch website. This server quickly processes the request, puts that all into an HTML file, and sends that to your browser. Now your browser does some thinking. While it's doing some thinking, it's actually rendering the page. All of this happens in a couple of milliseconds, right? Sometimes in like 5,000 milliseconds equaling 5 seconds or even less. But while it's done that, you see the page on your right. You actually get to interact with it. What's important to realize is that during this process where the browser is rendering the page, it's going to identify certain links, some references to other files like JavaScript, CSS, images. It goes out to the server and requests those. And then it also takes those files into consideration when rendering the page. These files were not initially, or the code that is in these files was not initially in the source code. So you can imagine that this JavaScript, for example, when it gets executed, it can actually make changes to the source code and therefore gets a little bit of different rendering. And because of that, it can create a different version of the page that you see than what is actually reflected in the source code. So now we know that the page that we see is actually the result of all of this information, from your local storage to the additional information that was requested from the server or even other servers that are not from this company per se, for marketing purposes, for example. All of this is used to create that page, to render that page. And what we have rendered is what is called the document object model, the DOM of the page. And that is what we're actually looking at when we're looking in the inspector, the Elements tab. So there is a big difference between looking at the view source, which is only the HTML, and the inspector, which is the result of all of these files rendered. Of course, this was a little bit simplified view of what happens between requesting a page and playing with it inside of the Chrome inspector. Stick around for all the other videos to learn a little bit more about this, and we'll go a little bit deeper while explaining the DevTools. But it's important to know that at this point, we're no longer going to be playing around with the source code. We're playing around with the DOM. Because anno 2020, there's a lot of JavaScript going on, especially when you're considering single page applications, and they really make lots and lots of changes to what the initial source code sent over. So in the next video, we'll be actually going inside of the Elements tab, finally, and we're going to be manipulating the DOM so that we can make changes to the page that we'll see. This is helpful because certain ideas can actually be visualized relatively quick before actually developers have to come in play. And that's handy if you need to convince management or your colleagues, for example. But before you go there, make sure to leave any questions in the comments below and like and subscribe if you learned a thing or two. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.